This video is sponsored by Intel. Hi Brollies, Marvin here from TechBroll.com, where we do unboxings, reviews, and sexy bureaus. And a week ago, I shared with you an unboxing video of all the components that we're going to use for an Intel build, and today, we're finally building it. We're going to build around the 10th Gen Intel Core i5-10400 processor and see how it performs for both productivity and gaming, especially in the highly anticipated Cyberpunk 2077. In this video, we're also going to feature the latest RTX 3060 Ti, the Asrock B460 Steel Legend motherboard, and a bunch of components that Deepcool has sent us. It should be fun, so let's get into it. Alright guys, in this video, we'll focus on the build experience and performance benchmarks, and if you're interested to know more about the components that we're going to use, you can check out my dedicated unboxing video here, but essentially, we're going to use the Intel Core i5-10400 processor since we're building a relatively affordable PC that should be ideal for anyone looking to build a decent PC for online learning, work from home, media consumption, and of course, gaming on the side. We're also going to partner it with an iChill RTX 3060 Ti, the latest and a more reasonable option from the newest Ampere series cards. For storage, we're going to use the XPG SX8200 Pro NVMe, which is the same drive that I used on my previous system. And for the memory, we're going to use the XPG Spectrix D60G 16GB kit, and we're going to connect all of these in the Asrock B460 Steel Legend motherboard. And to power all of them, we're going to use the Deepcool DQ850MV2L 80+ Gold power supply. In terms of cooling solution for our Intel Core i5-10400 processor, I was supposed to use the Deepcool AS500, but I encountered some clearance issues which I will share with you later. As for the case fans, we're going to use the gorgeous looking Deepcool MF120 GT, and we're going to put all of these components inside the nice and sleek Deepcool CL500 chassis. With the introduction of the components out of the way, let's cue the build montage.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
NANI?!
It sound right, boys. It sound right, boys. It sound right, boy.
Alright guys, building inside the Deepcool CL500 chassis is super easy. I didn't encounter any issues at all. However, like I said earlier, I was supposed to use the Deepcool AS500 CPU cooler, but unfortunately, the north side heatsink of the motherboard interferes with the heat pipes of the CPU cooler. Luckily, ID Cooling sent me their SE224XT CPU cooler, which perfectly fits on the Asrock B460 Steel Legend motherboard, so we're good to go. Aside from that, it's pretty much smooth sailing all throughout the build process. Going back to the Deepcool CL500 chassis, I appreciate that it has a built-in fan hub, which makes cable management a lot easier, and I don't have to worry about fan headers. Not that it's an issue with the Asrock B460 Steel Legend, as it actually has an ample amount of fan headers and RGB headers, which what I really like about this motherboard, aside from its robust quality and overall feature set. I also like the fact that the Deepcool MF120 GT case fans have everything you need inside the package, including a fan hub and an addressable RGB hub, which made my life a lot easier. And again, I don't have to worry about the amount of fan and RGB headers on my motherboard because everything is already taken care of right out of the box. And I guess this is the reason why the Deepcool MF120 GT case fans are pricier than most case fans, because it comes with a complete package, including some low noise adapters which you otherwise won't have with other budget alternatives. I also appreciate that the front panel cables of the Deepcool CL500 are already pre-managed with some Velcro straps, which takes away some of the cable management work. I am also quite happy that the cables of the Deepcool DQ850 MV2L power supply are flat and color black. Not to mention it is fully modular, so you only have to connect the cables that you need. Now, I have a question for you guys. When installing the front case fans, where do you install them? Inside the chassis or outside? Personally, I like to install my fans outside for a cleaner look inside. However, it's harder to screw it in from the inside. Let me know in the comments below what's your preferred orientation. And that's about it for the build experience. Now, let's proceed with our performance benchmarks. I'll pop my current methodology for testing PC builds on the screen so that you can check it out. And I believe it is important for me to share this information with you so that you can have an idea of how I came up with my results. Now, let's get the synthetic benchmarks out of the way real quick so that we can focus more on the real-world scenarios. Now, synthetic benchmarks are good and all, but nothing beats real-world performance testing. So, let's get into it. Starting with productivity using Adobe Premiere Pro 2020, as you can see, our Intel Core i5-10400 PC build can certainly get the job done even for 4K video editing and exporting. Granted, it's not the fastest export time, but for what it's worth, it's pretty decent. It's just around 10 minutes slower than my mini ITX build, which you can check out here by the way. And if your application or use case scenario only requires 1080p or 1440p resolution, then it should be more than sufficient. Now let's go ahead and check out how our Intel Core i5-10400 PC build performs in gaming. I'll give you more in-depth test results in Cyberpunk 2077 later, but before that, let's check out how it performs in some of the most popular FPS games. I'm all about FPS games, so that's what we are focusing on for this build. In Valorant, which is a relatively easy game to drive, our Intel Core i5-10400 PC build can easily handle it even at 4K resolution at balls-to-the-wall settings. Of course, no one plays a competitive FPS game in max settings, so it is safe to say that it can push even more frames than this. With this, you can pretty much take advantage of high refresh rate monitors up to 4K 200Hz. The same scenario can be said in CSGO, even at 4K and in very high settings, our Intel Core i5-10400 build pushes more than 200 frames per second. And if you play at 1440p, which in my opinion is the ideal resolution for a balance between image quality and performance, you can pretty much grab the latest 300Hz monitor out in the market. At this point, as we take a look at the performance of our Intel Core i5-10400 build in Rainbow Six Siege, it is safe to say that the combination of the Intel Core i5-10400 build and the iChill RTX 3060 Ti is substantial enough even up to 4K resolution for most competitive FPS titles. Granted, these FPS titles are relatively easy to run compared to AAA titles, but nevertheless, it's nice to know that 4K gaming is already within reach even on some relatively affordable components compared to years before. The only FPS game on our list that pushed our Intel Core i5-10400 build to its limit at 4K resolution is Apex Legends. You can still play at 4K resolution on this, but on lower frames per second. Now, 81.67 FPS is still pretty good in my opinion, and if you dial the settings down, you can certainly play at 4K using our build. Alright guys, now let's find out if our Intel Core i5-10400 build with an iChill RTX 3060 Ti can handle Cyberpunk 2077? And if yes, can we run ray tracing? And in what resolution? So let's get into it. Alright, so right off the bat, we can definitely observe that Cyberpunk 2077 is merciless when it comes to pushing your PC to its limits. Even at only 1080p resolution, we're getting around 85 FPS, which is a far cry from what we got from our FPS games earlier. However, do note that this is in ultra settings, which is what I will personally set this to enjoy all the visual goodness of this game. Now, 85 FPS is in my opinion pretty decent and still a relatively smooth gaming experience. Turning on DLSS or Deep Learning Super Sampling allows us to enable ray tracing while still getting relatively good frames per second. In my opinion, the DLSS quality setting gives us a good balance between good image quality and decent performance. As you can see, without the aid of DLSS, the FPS dropped down significantly to 60 FPS. Granted, it is still highly playable at 60 FPS, but giving up a bit of image quality of native rendering for DLSS to gain 20 FPS more is in my opinion a more reasonable option. Now, bumping the resolution up a bit to 1440p, we're getting just below 60 FPS without ray tracing and DLSS. It is still playable but without the visual fidelity of ray tracing. Turning on ray tracing at medium setting with the help of DLSS at quality preset makes the gaming experience a whole lot better in terms of, again, the balance between image quality and performance. 55 FPS with ray tracing on is pretty good. In my opinion, 1440p with medium ray tracing and quality DLSS is the sweet spot for our Intel Core i5-10400 build if you really want to push using ray tracing. Unless you want to go a bit higher in terms of frames per second, then you'll have to tweak the settings down a bit more. Now, with ray tracing enabled but without DLSS, the gaming experience is almost non-tolerable. 35 FPS is something you wouldn't want, especially in an open world environment like this. Looking at our frames per second at 4K resolution, even without ray tracing, it is safe to say that 4K gaming in Cyberpunk 2077 is too much for our Intel Core i5-10400 build to handle. 29 FPS is already close to a cinematic feel, which is far off from what you should experience in fast-paced gaming. Turning on RTX at medium settings, and even with DLSS quality preset on, doesn't change anything when it comes to our frames per second. We're still getting 30 FPS. Lastly, forget about 4K at native rendering, or better, forget about 4K gaming at all in Cyberpunk 2077 for our Intel Core i5-10400 build. It's just simply too much for it to handle. With that being said, as I pointed out earlier, 1440p resolution with medium ray tracing and quality DLSS setting is the way to go for our build, as it yields a decent 55 FPS with a good balance in terms of visual quality and performance. Here's a quick graph to summarize all of our Cyberpunk 2077 benchmarks. Moving on in terms of thermal performance, thanks to the good airflow of the Deepcool CL500 chassis, partnered with the Deepcool MF120 GT case fans, and the ID Cooling SE224XT CPU cooler, our Intel Core i5-10400 processor sits comfortably cool on all our tests, with an idle temperature of only around 29 to 32 degrees, an average load temperature of around 33 to 52 degrees, and maximum temperature when it spikes around 44 to 59 degrees. Even the most tasking application like video exporting in Adobe Premiere Pro 2020, it only got up to 59 degrees, which is awesome. Our iChill RTX 3060 Ti is also quite cool, maxing out at only around 66 degrees in Cyberpunk 2077, with an average temperature of around 35 to 58 degrees throughout all our testings. Now, when it comes to power draw, the Intel Core i5-10400 pulls just around 12.8 watts on idle and around 61.9 during load in our 3D Mark Far Strike Ultra, while the iChill RTX 3060 Ti managed to pull around 13.8 watts on idle and 216.2 during load. Now, in a real-world application, the Intel Core i5-10400 draws around 51.4 watts during load in Cyberpunk 2077, while the iChill RTX 3060 Ti draws around 218.7 watts. As a whole, our Intel Core i5-10400 PC build draws around 61.33 watts on idle and draws only around 315.3 watts during load in Cyberpunk 2077. This is way below our 850 watts power supply, which gives us a ton of headroom for potential upgrades down the path. Alright guys, so to conclude, our Intel Core i5-10400 PC build proved that you don't necessarily have to break the bank to enjoy PC gaming at a decent resolution and refresh rate. It was able to handle Cyberpunk 2077 with ray tracing at 1440p resolution with decent frame rates. It is a testament that you can pretty much play any recent AAA titles using this relatively budget build, and playing esports titles should be a piece of cake. It can also handle 4K video editing and exporting, photo editing in Photoshop, Lightroom, and pretty much any mainstream productivity application. The build also has good thermal performance thanks to the combination of the Deepcool CL500's mesh top and front panel for good airflow, decent RPM and CFM ratings of the Deepcool MF120 GT case fans, and the performance of the ID Cooling SE224XT CPU cooler. I also like the arsenal of the Asrock B460 Steel Legend motherboard with enough fan headers, RGB headers, and a ton of useful features both in hardware form and software. The iChill RTX 3060 Ti also proved capable on all our tests, including the Cyberpunk 2077 up to 1440p resolution with ray tracing medium settings on. Overall, I think our Intel Core i5-10400 PC build turned out pretty good and is suitable for those who are looking to build a budget PC for productivity, media consumption, online learning, graphics work, and gaming on the side. Now, I just want to add a quick note for those of you who want to squeeze their budget really tight. You can adjust some of the components and go for a cheaper alternative. For example, for the chassis, you can go for something like the Deepcool Matrix 55 mesh, which is cheaper but should provide pretty much the same good airflow. Instead of the Deepcool MF120 GT case fans, you can go for the Deepcool RF120. You will lose some of the aesthetic points and other features that the Deepcool CL500 and Deepcool MF120 GT case fans offer, but you will be able to fit more for a less amount of money. As for me, I'm good with this as I really like the features and look of both the Deepcool CL500 and the MF120 GT case fans, one of the better looking chassis and case fans out in the market. By the way guys, I just want to share with you that the current promotion of Intel was extended until February 28, 2021. So basically, you get a chance to win exciting treats from Intel for every purchase of any participating product. Check out the link below to learn more. And there you have it guys, thank you for watching. Huge thanks to Intel for sponsoring this video. You can get all the components used in this build from the links below. Thank you for watching, subscribe if you like this, and see you next time. Have a great day guys, you're awesome.